Good morning and welcome to the Clean Lakes Alliance Yahara Lakes 101 Science Cafe. That's a long title. I'm Colleen Johnson, financial planner and wealth management with Johnson Financial Group at Johnson Bank. And along with First Weber Foundation, Johnson Financial Group is proud to be a presenting sponsor for Yahara Lakes 101. These talks also couldn't be possible without hosting sponsor, the Edgewater, the University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and media partner ISPIS. So thank you. Also, this month's monthly sponsor is Task. So just a quick couple announcements before we lead you over to the presenter. First, we want to thank businesses and organizations that became lake partners in the month of September. Their names are on the screen behind me, so thank you very much. Lake partners make donations outside of tickets, sponsorships, or events. If your company hasn't signed up yet to be a 2019 lake partner, please see one of the Clean Lakes staff members. That would be great to do. Second, Clean Lakes Alliance Community Awards are only 2 months away. Held here at Edgewater on Tuesday, December 3rd. Community Awards recognize individuals and businesses making a difference in the watershed. The event is free to lake partners and friends. To secure your ticket and to nominate someone, visit cleanlakesalliance.org. Back to Yahara Lakes 101. The topic today is the decline of small fish in Madison Lakes. Over the last 50 to 100 years, many small species of fish have declined significantly or even disappeared. Today's talk will highlight how water quality impacts diversity of small fish, why it's important, and what we can do to help. So our presenter today is Dr. John Lyons. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Thank you. As self-described lifelong fish nerd. I love it. Dr. Lyons is currently the curator of fishes at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Zoological Museum, a position he's held since 1985. From 85 until his retirement in 2017, Lyons also served as fisheries research scientist and supervisor for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, where he studied ways to protect fish and their habitats and to improve fishing around the state. Awesome. But before we get to today's talk, we want to also introduce the one and only James Ty, our founder and executive director of Clean Lakes Alliance. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? I saw it coming in. I had to go to the chiropractor this morning, and driving in, steam was coming off Lake Windgrass, so it's definitely fall when the lake is warmer than the air. Thank you again, Colleen, and thank you for Johnson Financial for your continued support of Clean Lakes Alliance. Johnson Bank was one of the organizations that we went to back in 2010 to ask if they would support an organization to work on the water quality in Madison Lakes, and they stepped up right away. One of the founding supporters. Recently, Johnson Financial Group was a platinum sponsor of our golf event, which netted over $55,000 to help the organization fight phosphorus going to the lakes. The other big news is you might have found out that the Clean Lakes Alliance, along with Dane County and the Nation Conservancy, announced Alliant Energy's Challenge Grant, and they gave us $100,000 towards our $200,000 goal. This gives you the opportunity to donate to go right to a cause. Our Protect, Restore, and Preserve grants go out to projects throughout the community to directly reduce phosphorus, and we have this $200,000 goal. With this $100,000, we're halfway there, so think about giving us a little extra donation between now and the end of the year. It'd be greatly appreciated. The money, another news, Clean Lakes Alliance also is right now working on the Yahara Clean Compact. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we've had a lot of rain. And what we thought we needed to do to protect the lakes, we're going to have to do more at a faster pace. This compact brings together over 12 organizations that are here in the greater Madison area that have some sort of responsibility to reduce phosphorus going into the lakes. Our newest one is the Wisconsin Realtors Association. They're a strong advocacy group. There's over 3,000 realtors in Madison, and it's a great way to get the people who are buying homes, selling homes, and direct conduit, and they're very supportive of our effort, along with, more recently, the city of Middleton. We hope to have the compact signed by the end of the year. It's going to look at, one, what's the current amount of phosphorus coming into the lakes, what are the new practices we might need to do because of the extra rain, a timeline that we can commit to, and other resources like what we need to educate the public, and what can you do at your home. Speaking of what you can do at your home, besides being a lake partner and donating to us or being a friend, what you really need to do is get out there and rake the leaves. I actually cut the lawn on Friday, and I got my husband to actually rake the leaves in the middle of the street. Nobody does this on my block, so hopefully we can start teaching people how to do this, but it's a great way to think about this weekend. Leaves are a little bit more green, if everybody noticed, right? They haven't started to turn, but some neighborhoods they have. So I encourage you to go home today. It's a dry day, and then rake those leaves. Now with today's talk, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Lyons to tell us more about the decline of small fish in the Madison Lakes and what we can do to help the problem.
Can everybody hear me? All right. So we're all here because we care about. Move that down. We all care about the Madison Lakes, and we want to make them better. And we also realize that there's a lot of difficult challenges, a lot of substantial problems associated with the Madison Lakes. And unfortunately, I'm going to tell you about yet another problem, something that isn't perhaps on many people's radar, but is significant and important and something we need to be aware of and something we need to address. And that's the decline of these small fishes that I'll be talking about in the Madison Lakes over the last century. And so this is one of them, probably the prettiest of them, the Iowa darter, which many people think should be called the Wisconsin darter because it's a lot more common in Wisconsin than in Iowa. But it's one of the small fishes that occurs in the lake. This one's still there. And it's an important species for maintaining the ecological health of the ecosystem of the food chain in the lake. So we all know that the Madison Lakes are justifiably well known for their sport fishing. And so this is an important cultural activity. Lots of people who live here love to fish. And it's also an important economic driver in the region. There's a lot of people, both locally and from afar, who come to this area and spend a lot of money to fish as well and drive many of the businesses. So having a healthy fishery on the lake is important economically, it's important culturally, and it's also an indicator then of the overall health of the lake. It's the lakes themselves. And so here's a nice smallmouth bass caught out of Lake Mendota a few years ago. Now, Biology 101 says if you're going to have a lot of nice big sport fish, they have to have something to eat. And most of the sport fish that people focus on, the bass, the walleyes, the muskie, the white bass, whatever it happens to be, they require small fish to eat. And they're top predators. They can't subsist, most of them anyway, on things like zooplankton or insects. They really need small fish as part of their diet. And those small fish encompass all sorts of different species. And you've heard some of these names, even though you're not familiar with them, maybe minnows, shiners, darters, sculpins, silversides, killiefishes, mad toms. There's all sorts of different species. There's actually kind of an astounding and a really fascinating variety of small fishes that most people aren't too familiar with. And again, whether you know anything about them or not, they are essential if you're going to have a healthy sport fishery, if you're going to have a healthy ecosystem in the Madison Lakes. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those small fishes and what their characteristics are, because this will be important in determining why they're important and why it matters and why we need to try to restore them to a certain degree. So obviously by definition they're small. And when I say small, I mean that the maximum size of most of these is under 6 inches, and the vast majority are under 3 inches. So these are the little fish, maybe that you notice skipping around in the shallows when you're out there in your boat. They live in the relatively shallow water near shore, less than 10 feet. They're the things, again, you're going to see near the beach, you're going to see at the boat launch, places like that. Some of these species are adapted to live near the surface, some in mid-water, some in the bottom. So they've kind of carved up the ecological niches of the lake, and they utilize all of them. Most of them, and this has become important in some of the other areas, are tightly associated with aquatic vegetation. So they need healthy aquatic vegetation in order to survive and to thrive. A few do well in open water, but the vast majority are really connected with the aquatic plants in the system. And so how we manage the plants, of course, then is important for these fishes. They're also very short-lived. Many of our game fish can live 10, 15, 20, even 30 years. Most of these small fish live less than 3 or 4, often only 1 or 2 years. So there's a lot of turnover in these species. They're small, they're short-lived, and typically they're very abundant, but that means they're kind of boom or bust. When conditions are good, you can get a lot of little fish in a hurry. When conditions are bad, their populations plummet. And that's the natural order of these things. That's how they typically work. And so that when conditions are right for some fish, they're extremely abundant, and other small fish species might not be because they prefer a different set of conditions. All right. So if we look back 100 years ago in 1919, the Madison Lakes had at least 20 different species of small fishes found in the shallows that were, reasonably abundant. And again, we're not going to go through all of these, but these are the 20 different species, most of which were minnows. And most people think of minnows as any small fish, but minnows, in fact, is a specific type of fish. And some of them are oriented towards the surface, so they're going to be swimming up near the surface water. Most are kind of found in mid-water, swimming around in the middle of the water column. And then some are going to be found primarily on the bottom, actually right on the bottom substrate. So there are these 20 fish species, and if anyone's interested, I can happily go through what each one is and all the characteristics of them. But again, right off the bat, that tells you there's maybe a lot more variety out there than you realized. There's a lot of different small fish out there historically. And each of these is a little bit different in exactly where it lives, what it eats, its ecological attributes, what conditions it prefers, those sorts of things. But collectively, they all filled the lake ecosystem 100 years ago. Well, we know that in the last 100 years, a lot of things have changed in the Madison Lakes. And these changes have all impacted these small fish. So, of course, the lake has become increasingly developed over time. And many stretches of shoreline now are basically riprap, seawalls, and there's no natural shoreline habitat left. And most of these fish, as I said, require aquatic vegetation, they require natural habitat. So as the shoreline develops, they're going to have less and less habitat and get less common. I should say, to be fair though, that compared to most urban lakes, the Madison Lakes really have a lot of protected natural shoreline. Certainly if you compare this to the lakes, for instance, in Waukesha County, where every inch of most of those lakes have developed. And in Lake Mendota, you have Second Point and Picnic Point. In Monona, you have Olin Turtle Park. Wabeesa, you have Lake Farm Park and the Wabeesa Wetlands. Kaganza State Park. Lake Wingara, you have the Arboretum. So there's still enough habitat out there. Certainly there's less than there used to be, and that's had an impact, but there's still sufficient habitat, and that alone can explain some of the declines we've seen. The other issue, and of course this has been in the news a lot the last couple of years with all the flooding, is the lake levels have been artificially raised and are often then manipulated in a seasonal sense. So the lakes are often kept artificially high during the summer. And that's, of course, been a huge issue with all the flooding last fall and going into this year. And there's a big debate now about what we should do with Lake Mendota, how should we drain these lakes faster, things like that. But that has also had consequences for many of the fish in the lakes. They prefer a more natural water level regime where things fluctuate depending on what the weather's doing rather than always staying at a constant level, which, again, most recreational people like. And again, in many cases, artificially keeping things high has drowned areas that they would normally use. Again, but these manipulations are long-standing, and some of the lakes aren't manipulated as much as others. So again, while it's had an impact, and it's important in the big scheme of things, it alone doesn't account for what we're seeing out there. And then finally, of course, this is what most of you are here and worried about, and that is the water quality of the lakes, the algal blooms that happen, the blue-green algae making the lakes almost unusable at times. And this is a picture from Lake Mendota last year during the middle of the summer. No one really wants to go in water like that. And so a lot of these small fishes are fairly sensitive to water quality and need good, clear water in order to survive. So this, again, is a problem. But we're fortunate the lakes are big. The lakes have a lot of variety. And even in those bad algal bloom days, there are always refuges. There are always bays and creek mouths and areas that aren't nearly as bad and where a lot of these fish species would normally have a place sort of to go to get out of that nasty green water. And also a lot of the blooms are episodic. They don't last all summer. So again, hasn't helped the situation, but certainly isn't alone a reason for why we're seeing the declines that I'm going to mention in a minute. So if we take those three things together, they're going to mean that what we see now, it's not surprising that there's fewer fish, fewer species, and lower abundance than what we'd seen 100 years ago. But really, the coup de grace, I think, and what really has pushed things off the edge has been what's happened with the aquatic plants in the system, and particularly the rise of Eurasian water milfoil in the 60s and 70s. So recall that I said most of these species are associated with aquatic plants, and they're associated with native aquatic plants. And many species are adapted to feed and spawn on particular types of native aquatic plants. So when milfoil came in, it upset the apple cart. It changed the aquatic plant distribution, the aquatic plant community out there in massive ways. And unlike most of the native species, milfoil can get much, much thicker. And it can coat, as you're well aware if you're out on the lakes, it can coat the surface, it can fill in all the little interstices, all the little openings. It can mean poor water quality underneath because there's no water circulation. So this really blocks access, blocks circulation, changes water quality. And this really has been, for most of these fish, really the major impact that's happened over the last 100 years. So you put all those things together, the shoreline development, the lake level manipulations, the water quality issues, and then finally the rise of Eurasian water milfoil, and this is what we have left in 2019. We've lost more than half of the species, okay? There's still a few things out there that are fairly common, and I don't want to imply that there's nothing out there or that the game fish are going to starve. That's not the issue at all. Some of these fish species, particularly that's a brook silverside in the upper right corner, those species are doing quite well, and they're quite abundant, and they've become increasingly the dominant diet item for many of the fish species that are out there, where before they had 20 different species to choose from. Now they have, half dozen, 8, 9 to choose from. But that doesn't mean they don't have anything to eat, so I don't want to overstate the problem. But certainly if we're interested in protecting biodiversity, if we're interested in maintaining a natural community, this is troubling that we've lost over half the species that used to be here in the last 100 years. And so it begs the question of what can we do about it, and why does this matter? Well, the thing to keep in mind and why this matters is that, recall that I said these things naturally fluctuate. And so it's normal that in 1 year, one species is going to be really common and another species is going to be uncommon. And a couple of years later, they might be exactly the opposite. That's typical. The issue here is none of them are all in sync with each other. So when you have 20 species, the odds of all 20 species being low in one particular year is remote. There's always going to be a few species that are going to be doing well, even when it's maybe a down year for most of the others. The fewer species you have out there, the more likely you're going to have a situation where it's bad for everybody. And so what it means is that the overall net, when you combine everything together, as opposed to looking at one individual species, the overall total abundance is a lot more variable now than it used to be. So there's some years when there's tons of forage out there, there's tons of small fish and lots of food for the game fish. But there are other years where maybe things aren't nearly as abundant. And so they reach levels that you wouldn't have seen 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there were just enough species. And this is what we call, and again, there's more diversity, less chance of all species having things together. This is what we call the portfolio effect. And this is one reason why biodiversity, having lots of species, is important. It sort of gives you cover when things fluctuate. And it's just like when you're investing in the stock market or any kind of financial portfolio. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to have a diverse mix of stocks and bonds and real estate and all that sort of thing to make sure that when a 2008 crash happens, that you are covered and you don't have everything in one type of stock and you're going to be bankrupt. Well, it's the same idea with these small fish. When you just have a handful of fish out there, you're much more likely to have the Great Recession or a Great Depression in terms of abundance. And then that affects the entire food web. And so all of a sudden, when there's no fish out there, no small fish out there, there's no fish for the bass or the walleyes or the pike or whatever to eat, and they're going to grow slower, they're going to have less reproduction, they're going to be less abundant. So when you have 20 fish species out there, the odds of a big crash of all the species are pretty slim. When you have 9 species out there, I won't say it's highly likely that you're going to have a crash, but each species that we lose makes that crash, that sort of bad year for everybody, more and more likely. So at the moment, the fisheries out there are still good, but if some of those species that are still out there, blink out, we're just going to get closer and closer to the catastrophe of really nothing for the fish out there to eat. Hasn't happened yet, and so I don't want to get people in a crisis mode that the fisheries out here are going to collapse because the prey base has disappeared. But as we lose species, we get closer and closer to that point. And with 9, the odds are still not tremendous that things are going to go bad all at once, but they're a lot greater than they were 100 years ago. And if we go another 50 years and things don't improve, and now we're down to 3 or 4 species, small fish out there, which is the trend, then it's almost certain that we're going to start having bad years, and we're going to start to really see an impact in the actual sport fish population. So what I'm talking about here, there's obviously been a biodiversity loss. There's obviously been a problem with this one part of the food web. It hasn't manifested itself yet in the sport fishery, but it's something that's looming on the horizon if we don't do something and don't try to bring some of these fish species back. We're going to have a less stable and fishery and more likelihood of an actual collapse. So what can we do? How can we try to at least stop the decline and hopefully bring some of these species back? Well, 4 areas that cause the problem are the 4 areas we have to work on. Of course, shoreline development. I'm not expecting houses to disappear and go back to natural areas. I mean, that's unrealistic. But there's certainly ways you can manage the shoreline in front of people's houses, in front of people's businesses in a more sustainable way and create more natural habitat. And so a lot of it is removing, these sort of hardened structures, seawalls, riprap, and going to a more gradual slope, a more natural vegetated shoreline. Now that means you're going to have more wave action. You're not going to be able to maintain a nice lawn right up to the edge. But if indeed you want to have some of these fish species come back and create more habitat, it's sort of a change in what we visualize as a good-looking or healthy shoreline. And again, none of these are simple, and none of them have an easy answer, but that is what would need to be done. Water level manipulation. Everyone here is aware of how tricky that's going to be, particularly with the flooding. And I won't, at this point, certainly the flooding is going to take precedence on any kind of ecological restoration. So I don't want to imply that we should have people's houses, floods or property floods so that these small fish can come back. But it's certainly something that needs to be considered when we're going through all these plans and trying to deal with the flooding that's been plaguing the shorelines for the last couple of years. Water quality, of course, that's why most of you are here. This idea of improving water quality, reducing phosphorus inputs, taking care of improving the quality of the runoff that gets into the lake. Obviously a difficult, long-term problem, but this is yet another reason why it's a good thing to do and why everyone should redouble their efforts. It's not just to make the lake look nicer or smell nicer, but a lot of the species that live in the lake are being impacted directly by this as well. And then milfoil, again, something we've been struggling with since they first appeared in the 60s, so it's a 50-year problem. Again, no easy answer. Whole lake, and massive herbicide treatment is not the answer because that's going to eliminate the native plants as well. So you're not doing anything for the small fish species if you're eliminating all the plants. So it's going to be selective cutting and also carp control. Carp, for whatever reason, again, an invasive species that causes lots of problems. One of the problems it causes is that it promotes milfoil. It breaks up the milfoil into these fronds that recolonize areas. It selectively eats more of the native plants than it does of the milfoil itself. So carp, when they're abundant, tend to make the milfoil problem actually worse. And so, again, this is something we've struggled with. Carp control is something we've struggled with for well over 100 years. So none of these are simple. But again, it's things we have to work on just to hold the line, much less try to bring back some of these species. But then that brings up the issue, if we do indeed want to bring back some of these species, they're gone. There's no easy way for them to recolonize. It's not like they're further downstream in the Yahara or up in one of the little tributaries. They're gone. And so it's going to involve reintroducing some of these fish and actually bringing them back. Now we have lots and lots of experience introducing things like walleyes and bass and muskies and northerns, the sport fish, and there's a big infrastructure in the state with the DNR and with private industry to do that sort of thing. We have very little experience and very little infrastructure dedicated to trying to bring back some of these smaller non-game, so-called forage species that the larger fish eat. So there's definitely going to be a learning curve. There's definitely needs to be some studies and experimentation done. We don't have a cookbook plan for how to do this. But I think we actually have a very promising situation to try this, to do some experimental reintroductions, and that's actually in Lake Wingra. And the reason Lake Wingra works as a study area is, first of all, it's small and contained. It's a much smaller area. It's a manageable habitat to try to do something compared to the other lakes, which of course are much bigger. But it has a number of things going for it. So it has, of all the lakes, it has the least shoreline development. Okay, so there's the most natural habitat with the arboretum and the parks that go along there. There is a dam at the outlet that has raised the level of the lake, certainly, but that's been there for a long time, and there are no seasonal manipulations. There's no fluctuations closing and opening dams and raising lower water levels the way it happens on the other lakes. The water quality isn't the greatest. It's not, certainly not the most attractive water sometimes, but it really doesn't seem to have those really awful blue-green blooms that you see in some of the other lakes. It's never that clear, but it's never that turbid either. It's sort of an in-between lake. And the best news is that they've actually had some success. The DNR and the county working together have had some success with carp control out there. And so the aquatic plant situation over the last decade, they did just as background, they did a sort of an experimental winter carp removal. They figured out where all the carp were in the middle of the winter and removed a big chunk of them all at once during netting under the ice during the winter. And somewhat to everyone's surprise, the carp have not really bounced back since then. The carp have remained fairly low. And as a consequence, the plants have recovered, in fact, to the point where a lot of people complain that there's too many plants out in the middle of Lake Wingra now. But the important thing is there's certainly lots of milfoil out there still, but it's not all milfoil. And so there's a pretty diverse aquatic plant population out there. A lot of native species have made a comeback in the last decade. And again, you'll find all the milfoil you want out there, but it doesn't dominate the way it does in some areas. And so it seems like a good place to actually give this a try, of all the places in the lake. And so I think it'd be a very interesting experiment to see if we could actually bring back some of these species. And I'll just throw out a couple different species as possible candidates. There are two closely related species of minnow. This is the black-nosed shiner on the left and the black chin shiner on the right. They look very, very similar to each other, and they're actually very attractive small fish. And the interesting thing is that in the 1940s, black chin shiner was reported to be the most common fish in Lake Wingra, more common than the bluegills. So if you know how many little bluegills are out in Lake Wingra, and it's on the order of 1 million or so, there was actually more of these in the 1940s. By the 1970s, they were completely gone. And so that's the kind of change there's been. And everything kicked in, but I think milfoil was the primary reason. When milfoil came into Wingra, it came in really big and really made a mess of things. It's sort of it's a case study, Lake Wingra, for how an invasive species can rapidly, completely change an ecosystem. And this is one of the changes. Those species disappeared. The other thing going for these species is that there's been a little work in some other states actually trying to reintroduce these. Other people are having the same problem. These species are disappearing. There's the same concern, and so there's been effort in Illinois and New York and Minnesota actually reintroducing some of these species. And the early reports from those are pretty good. They've had some luck, had some success. So some colleagues and I are kicking around this idea. We're all retired, so we have to see how much energy we're going to have in the next 5 years to tackle something like this. But it doesn't need to be, this giant multi-million-dollar project. These fish are small and relatively inexpensive to raise. You can come up with a lot of them in a small area with a relatively small capital investment and stocking them, so forth. So it's not like you're going to build a brand new hatchery and try to raise muskies, which it is indeed a multi-million-dollar exercise. But this is something like a multi-thousand-dollar exercise. So part of the reason I'm here is to just throw this idea out here, get it on your radar, and just get a sense of what people think of this and whether people think this is worthwhile to pursue, and how we might go about it, and collaborators and cooperators and so forth. As a backstory, these same colleagues, the we out there that I'm talking about, we're doing a similar reintroduction of a different small fish in the Wisconsin River. And to our amazement, it seems to be working. And so we're kind of optimistic that this sort of an approach might actually work. But again, the idea is we're not quite at the crisis level yet with the disappearance of small fish, but we're approaching it. And so it's time to stop the trend that we have and hopefully reverse it. And this would be a way to reverse it. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah, Bob.
What role do the tributaries stream?
Here, I'm going to have you repeat your question, but with the microphone.
What role do the tributary streams play in the ecology of these fishes, and what can we do if they are a valued part of the ecosystem for these little guys?
Well, Are you talking in the sense that maybe they would survive in the tributaries? Or, I mean, there's, obviously the tributary is important to the water quality and the functioning of the lake. And so, but in terms of an actual habitat for these species, many of these species are really lake dwellers. They don't do well in flowing water. So when things got bad in the lake, they really couldn't retreat to the tributaries. That being said, a lot of the tributaries are in worse shape than the lakes themselves. So there wasn't necessarily a good refuge for them anyway. There are some species on that list that might survive in the tributaries, conceivably, but at this point they don't. And a lot of the tributaries, if they were to be restored, would be too cold, actually. Most of these species need relatively warm water, and believe it or not, Pheasant Branch and the Yahara River, if they were fully restored to what they were a couple hundred years ago, they'd probably be trout streams. And so they're a little too cool in their optimal configuration. So I won't say they're unimportant, but I don't think they're particularly key to this. It's a lake situation.
So looking at the small fish, you said they're fairly short-lived.
Correct.
If there's a collapse in those, what kind of time period would we be looking at for the sport fish, for the top predator fish? So if you wipe out, if there is a catastrophic collapse in small fish for 1 year, how long does that perturbation affect the longer lived fish?
Well, the main importance of these fish is particularly early in the spring. So later in the spring, there's lots of other fish. There's the juveniles of all the sport fish. So there's little perch, there's little bluegills, there's things like that are being produced that the game fish will happily eat. The issue is in April and May, before these other species have spawned, these are the fish that are out there, the small fish that are small enough for the juvenile game fish to eat. So a big muskie can eat all sorts of things. But a newly hatched game fish that might only be a couple inches long, it really needs these small fish. It has no other alternative. So the key time point period for where these fish are really crucial is early in the spring, so April, May into June. And again, if they were to they're not going to completely disappear, but if they were to get very low during that period, that would basically eliminate reproduction from they'd reproduce, but the fish wouldn't survive. So the fish that were there in the spring, their reproduction would cease. And so you'd be missing then that year of game fish out there. Now the game fish are very long-lived. They can spawn again the following year. So it would start showing up gaps. And so instead of having fish from every year coming into the population to be caught, you'd start having these gaps where there was nothing there. And so the population isn't going to collapse. That's the advantage per se. It's just going to get lower, and it's going to get more variable, and it's going to start fluctuating. And if you ever dealt like I did in the DNR with anglers, they want fish now. It's hard to explain. Well, just wait a couple years, everything will be better. Well, no, I'm going to the lake now. Where are the fish? And so these short-term fluctuations really are problematic then if you're going to have a stable fishery. And if people get the idea that, well, some years Mendoza's good and other years it's terrible, often they'll say, I'm going to go fish somewhere else.
If you were to reintroduce shiners on winglet, wouldn't you have to get rid of that milfoil first?
You don't have to get rid of all of it, and that's why milfoil's not a problem because it exists. It's a problem because it just gets so dominant and eliminates everything else, and makes for this kind of weed-choked, poor water quality, no circulation situation. So if milfoil's down at a kind of a moderate level, lots of studies show these fish will do just fine. And so that's what's happened in Wingret. It used to be basically at this choking level all the time. And it's still common out there. I don't want to imply that milfoil has disappeared from Wingret. Absolutely not. But now it's not so dominant. A lot of these other species, these other plants that the small fish actually prefer, are a lot more common. So it's an experiment, but I think the situation is much more favorable in Wingret now than it would have been, say, 10, 15 years ago.
John, we have a question here, and please just raise your hand and
Yeah.
I'll put the microphone.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could speak to the process of reintroducing them and then monitoring, how do you track to see about your success, or how are these other experiments tracked?
Yeah, it's actually pretty straightforward. So ideally, you want to stock as many fish as you can into the lake to give them a good chance to take and remain. One option is to actually go to another lake where they're really common and do what we call a field transfer and just catch as many as you can and bring them over to Wingra and put them in the lake. And we're talking here thousands. We hope to be stocking thousands of fish. That's the kind of numbers we want. The other option is to bring a smaller number into some sort of a pond or hatchery situation and then breed them and then raise up thousands of them and stock those as well. So you can do it either way, and it'd be a question of what's the most efficient way to do it, what's the easiest way to do it. And then once they're in the lake, it's pretty easy to actually monitor these, to net these fish and to determine if they're there. They're going to be in the shallow water, they're going to be in these weedy areas, we know how to catch them. So you certainly would have to do follow-up. You'd have to, once you put the fish in there, you'd want to be monitoring to see, A, that the fish you stocked survive, but ideally that in a couple of years, there are new fish coming up, because remember, these fish only live 2-3 years. So you might stock them all in there, they do fine, but they don't reproduce. Well, then in 2 or 3 years, they're going to be gone. So the hope is that in 2 or 3 years, you'd have a new cohort, a new generation coming up. But the monitoring is pretty straightforward. And obviously, there's logistics and work, but conceptually, it's pretty straightforward.
I'm thinking about bioaccumulation and that many of the cyanobacteria blooms occur in the nearshore environment. Have the small fish ever been tested for cyanotoxins like microcystin?
Not to my knowledge, although most of the microcystin toxins would be toxic to them. So I don't know that they would necessarily pass that on to the larger fish so much as it would actually kill them directly. And again, that's one reason why Wingra, I think, is a good place to start, because I won't say there's no algae blooms there, there's no cyanobacteria, but you don't see the horrendous sorts of blooms that we've seen out on the Madison Lakes lately. So I don't, the water quality itself could limit, if the water quality wasn't good enough, these fish might not survive, but they wouldn't be passing something on up the food chain, at least in terms of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins.
I'm just wondering if there are lakes in Wisconsin that are historically ecologically similar to the Yahara Lakes that are in a much better, that haven't lost half of these small fish species, or kind of where the spectrum is around the state on this.
Well, the species I'm talking about, for the most part, aren't particularly uncommon. And so there are lots of lakes, for instance, up north where these species are abundant, and they've done fine. Now, those lakes aren't necessarily directly analogous to the Madison Lakes. They're not as productive. They have a colder climate and so forth. A lot of the lakes in Waukesha County are analogous. They're these marl lakes with really high calcium carbonate and naturally fairly highly productive systems. There are still some lakes in Waukesha, Walworth, that area east of Milwaukee or west of Milwaukee, where some of these species hold on. Most of them decline pretty precipitously there, and they're not nearly as common as they were, but they haven't actually disappeared. And in Madison Lake, again, you have this, like I said, there are 4 different things going on. In some of these Waukesha County lakes, the main thing going on is shoreline development or milfoil. They have 1 or 2 of the 4 problems that the Madison Lakes have. And so the fish species still survive there, but they're not that common, and they're definitely at risk in these systems. And so if we were looking for a place to get fish to bring to the Madison Lakes, we'd be looking somewhere, further north in a much less degraded system. And that being said, there's some lakes around Wapaka, for example, that have some of these. And certainly if you get up to Vilas County or Sawyer County or places like that, these fish are adaptable, they don't need the exact, doesn't have to be identical to the Madison Lakes, but, and that would be a consideration. We don't want to remove fish that are, from a completely different environment, but we'd have to look a bit afield. There's nothing local. There's no local source for it.
Can you talk a little more about the status of your project and in particular how you're being funded or might be funded?
Well, there's no project. I guess this is a high, I won't even call it a proposal. This is an idea. And so that is the question. I think, again, conceptually to do this, like I said, we have a different project where we've sort of worked out some of the kinks with a different species in a different environment. And that sort of led me to even think about doing it in the Madison Lakes because we've been successful. And there have been other states where they've done things with the exact species I'm talking about with some success. So that encourages me. But at this point, it's just in the idea stage. There isn't even a proposal. And so if it were to go forward, if everyone said, let's do this, and got excited about it, we're still talking a few years out to get everything lined up. And the biggest issue would be funding for it. Like I said, it's not, millions of dollars, but it's tens of thousands of dollars. So it's not something I can do out of my pocket or, you can crowdsource, $500. You're going to need more than that. So that's one of the big questions is how would we fund this? That's not known at this point.
Have you pitched it to the DNR?
I haven't pitched it. This is the first place I've ever pitched it. I say that when I was with the DNR, this was always on my radar, and I always thought about it. And I used to think about, well, how would we do this internally within DNR? And there was no way to do it. I won't say no way, but it would have been very difficult. So that was the problem. That's why we didn't buy something like this 20 years ago. There wasn't an obvious way to do it.
Dr. Lyons, thank you very much for presenting this and helping us understand maybe the ecological issues that are going on in this system. I'd like if you could talk a little bit more about the trophic level beneath the small fish. What's going on with the stuff that they eat, and how much is that an influence of their disappearance and their population and abundance and diversity? And I really would like to know a little bit more about that lower trophic level, what's happening at that level. And secondly, is there any role of wetlands in this situation, and is there anything that we could do about the wetlands? You really haven't talked anything about them, and I don't know how much their role is for this very small fish. Thank you.
Sure. So most of these fish are not eating these small fish. They're going to be eating various invertebrates. So some of them eat zooplankton, and most of them pick small invertebrates, small insects off of aquatic plants in particular. No one's really studied directly their feeding ecology in these lakes, but we certainly know that the zooplankton communities in the lakes have changed, and we know that particularly because of water milfoil, the availability of various aquatic insects on the plants has changed. And that's why I say the plants are particularly important, that it's structural in the sense that these plants choke out areas and change water quality, but it's also in terms of what sort of invertebrates, what sort of small insects live on milfoil compared to on native aquatic plants. And it's been shown that milfoil has a less diverse community of small invertebrates. And I think that probably is part of the reason why some of these species have declined. But it's not just that. They also spawn on some of these plants. And so milfoil isn't as good for that sort of thing. And so it's certainly been a factor. And we haven't studied it directly, but we know that these things have changed a lot. And undoubtedly that's contributed. Now, what was your second question?
The other question was about wetlands, marshes.
Wetlands.
What are the effects of the role of those in the small?
Well, some of these species do use wetland areas, but most of them don't. And so there's a few species up there that would use a healthy wetland area, and so wetlands are certainly an important part of the mix. And so restoring wetland habitat and making it more accessible in some cases, which is the issue, it's sort of blocked off, would be important and would help. The two species that I talked about for wingra, the black chin and the black nose, are not really wetland species, but some of the other ones up there are. And so if wetlands, shoreline, and we're talking shoreline wetlands, if those shoreline wetlands were improved, it would undoubtedly help. So it's not, I'd say maybe a third of the species there use wetlands in some form or another, and a couple of them use them quite a bit. But probably most of them, it's more the actual, well, not open shoreline, but the vegetated shoreline of the lake that's the prime habitat.
Regarding the Lake Wingra project.
The Lake Wingra idea. The Lake Wingra idea.
So you have the Arboretum and Biology Park and Edgewood College. I mean, they all seem like to be supportive and cooperate maybe. And I wonder if you can speak to
I agree, and I think if this were to go forward, I think those would be very likely and key collaborators and cooperators. And that would be the hope, that they would sort of buy into this and find it important and help. And I think, again, I think it could be a really valuable sort of public outreach, public education sort of opportunity, and meet some of their mandates, and certainly the arboretums to restore, the natural quality of the lake, and Edgewood as an educational, the zoo as an educational conservation group. So those are good ideas. Those are certainly potential collaborators. Like I said, it's an idea at this point. You're the first group that I've approached. So, but if we were to go forward with this, I think they would certainly be, at least invited to participate.
I think it's a great idea. I like fishing, so I
Me too.
One way that you could fund it would be to create a game fish stamp for the Madison chain that you would buy on your fishing license. There's precedent for that because you buy a salmon license for Lake Michigan. Could make it voluntary, but if you could start voluntary, I think a lot of fishermen would support it.
Having been in the DNR and struggled to get the license fee increases, I think the idea that I agree with you, but I think the reality is that it would never happen as an actual requirement. It just the political landscape is just not there. Even within our existing stamps and our existing licenses, they don't pay the bills at this point. There's more being spent than's being taken in, and so I don't think that would happen. Now that being said, some sort of volunteer fundraising with sort of through the Madison Fishing Expo, for example, or some of the other clubs and groups on the lake is another really interesting scenario, because I'm interested in the fish for their own sakes, but they're also critical to the health of the sport fishery, and so they're important in two different ways, not different, but two ways. And so certainly I would think that anglers, if they understood, that these are the basis of their fishery, I would think they'd be interested. So that's another good idea, but it would be voluntary. There's no way there'd be an official requirement. It just wouldn't happen.
I was thinking about sport fishing, and as we were talking about carp, why isn't there, something that we could do about the carp, either making them a trophy fish, where we're doing something that there's a bounty or something on these carp that we would try to enlist everybody to get active. I see the lights on the lake at night, spearfishing going on. Why isn't that just couldn't that be, more popular or fun event for people to try to get rid of these fish?
Well, in a nutshell, carp were brought into this country in the 1880s, and they were thought they were going to be the savior of declining fisheries. And 10 years later, everyone realized what a mistake, because they put them everywhere and they were causing havoc among the native ecosystems. So by the 1890s, we were in full carp control removal phase, and we've been doing it ever since with limited success. And so your idea is, for example, bounties, we've tried that. We pay commercial fishermen to come in to remove carp. You can catch carp any way you want, any time of year, in any quantity. There's no regulations. They're what's called a rough fish. And so yes, you can go out and spear them, you can go out and bow hunt them, you can catch them with your hands. But carp have proven to be incredibly resilient and incredibly good at persisting. They have ideal habitat here. They've been dodging hooks and spears and stuff for thousands of years. And so carp control, the state and the country have spent literally billions of dollars to try to control carp with limited success. In the past, we used to poison everything in the lake and start over. That was a very common management scheme in the 50s and 60s. And it never worked. Usually the one fish that came back first was the carp, even though they'd stock. You could never completely eliminate them, and they're very persistent. So when we actually, and I can't claim any credit for this, but some of the DNR in the county and the city folks who about 10 years ago came up with this winter carp removal on Wingra, that was surprisingly effective given our 130-year track record of limited success. And what was even more surprising was that typically when you remove a whole bunch of carp and make all this effort, then the surviving carp go wild. You know, they reproduce like crazy, they grow like crazy, and within a few years are back where they used to be. But here they haven't. And so that's what gives me some hope that maybe in this situation the carp have been knocked down to, they're not gone and they won't ever be gone, but they've been knocked down to a level where they aren't quite as so problematic. And whether we can do this in other lakes, you know, I don't know, but at least in Wingra, it seems to work. So there's one place where you can still find carp out there, but not at the densities they used to be. So, but your question is something people, the best minds in fisheries have been struggling with for generations with limited success. Yeah.
Thank you. I understand that water levels are seeming to be the new normal, and do these higher water levels sort of play into your idea? Would you adjust your thinking based on new water levels if it looks like the new water levels are going to be higher, which it certainly does appear that way to me?
Well, I think high water levels by themselves aren't the issue if they stay that way. The issue is two things. If you have a shoreline that's already really developed and you have these steep riprap shores and seawalls and things like that, high water, basically now instead of having water that's a few inches deep right next to the shore, which would be the natural situation, you have water that's waist deep next to the shore. And a lot of these small fish do best in really shallow water. And so if you have a natural shoreline, then, you know, higher water levels over time, the shoreline and the fish will adjust to that. And so in University Bay, for example, as the water level comes up, there will still be habitat for fish. If you're over by Shoreward Hills or something where everybody's got a pile of riprap and so forth, then as the water level comes up, there's no shallow water anymore. And so high water per se in a natural setting is just something that everybody has to adjust to. Where the shoreline's artificial, high water is going to make things more difficult. And but the bigger issue is when you start manipulating them, when you start keeping levels artificially high or drawing them down in the winter, for example, to protect docks and things like that, which they do in a lot of, not just the Madison Lakes, but other lakes. That's where it gets problematic, because often you're doing the opposite of what these fish have evolved to deal with. And so they're fairly resilient. They can, if that was the only problem in the lakes, they'd be okay. But it's, you know, it's one more thing, you know, in a long list of things that are impacting them. So again, I wouldn't propose that, oh, we, you know, don't deal with flooding, so these fish, you know, that no. But keeping things higher in some situations is going to make things worse.
I think we're actually out of time this morning. I want to give Dr. Lyons one more round of applause. Just quick announcement before everybody leaves. Next Thursday, October 17th, we're going to have our farm tour at Highland Springs Farms in Oregon. It's completely free. Anybody who grew up on a farm here? Not a lot of us, which is something our executive director likes to point out. So the more that we learn about the farms and how they sort of fit into the puzzle, the better off we are. So You can find out more at cleanlakesalliance.org/events. Again, totally free. Next month's Yahara Lakes 101 will be our last of the year. Speaking of farms, we will have Yahara Pride Farms President, Executive Director?
Right,
Chair Jeff Endres, who operates a farm on the north end of the watershed and is going to talk about farm practices and watershed benefits. So very interesting. And then, of course, really quick, our community awards are here, presented by Tom Bank on December 3rd. If you're a friend or a lake partner, you are able to come for free. Or if you know somebody who is a champion here in our watershed, there are 5 different categories, cleanlakesalliance.org/awards, and you can nominate somebody, and we'd love to see you here. So thank you very much, and have a great day.